Plan scope management. This is a process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. We have a number of inputs coming from the project management plan, which is that compilation of all of the component and subsidiary plans within the project and how we are going to get the work done. The quality management plan tells us how we are going to ensure that we are building quality into our products or into our deliverables. Now, a very important aspect of this is, well, doing all of that quality work becomes part of our overall project scope, and we have to go ahead and account for that. So it kind of becomes a two-way street. Here we're worried about the deliverable, and there we're worried about whether or not that deliverable has quality. But at the same time, there is quite a bit of crossover, so we want to have an eye on exactly how we're going to be ensuring that quality is present and being built in. The project lifecycle description. So, as we're looking at this project, do we have different phases and what type of phases will we be using? And the development approach. In some situations where we have a very low level of task risk and we know exactly what must be done and how it must be done, we can do a very predictive life cycle. If you were to ask me to repave an asphalt parking lot, I could probably go ahead and plan for every contingency and everything that needs to occur. But if we were to go ahead and develop a new mobile banking application, that might be a little bit more difficult. We might not be able to capture all of the requirements on the front end. So perhaps we might want to go to more of an adaptive or agile development approach. Data analysis, especially alternatives analysis, is a spectacular tool when it comes to planning your scope management. So, how can we elaborate the scope of the project and product, collect requirements, and validate scope? One of the ways that we talk about is progressive elaboration, starting with a very broad plan. And as more information becomes available with the passage of time, we can go ahead and add to everything. And that is somewhat difficult in some situations, as stated previously, as part of the development approach. If we are able to capture all of the requirements at the front end, normally you want to do that. But in other situations, a progressive elaboration becomes much more necessary. So the output from this process is the scope management plan. This is a document that describes how the scope will be defined, developed, monitored, controlled, and verified. Now, again, at this point, we're just figuring out the how. So we're laying the groundwork for further planning. So all the other processes within the project scope management knowledge area will look to this output as its northern star. One of the outputs of this process is a scope management plan. This is a document that describes how the scope will be defined, developed, monitored, controlled, and verified. Now, it's very important to note at this point, we're still laying the groundwork for further planning processes to occur. This process, especially this output right here, will guide all the other processes within the project scope management knowledge area. So, what is our process for preparing a scope statement? What should it look like? What should it include? What's our process for developing, improving, and maintaining the work breakdown structure? What's the process for the scope baseline being approved and maintained? And how are we going to make changes to that scope baseline? Because at some point we may need to add to or possibly even descope. The process specifying how formal acceptance of deliverables will be attained. And we want to capture this kind of early on. I really want to know who's going to have signature authority and what exactly are they going to be looking for. If we don't know that, then we might be building something that is not really what they had in mind, and that's not a good situation to find out once you get to that user acceptance testing. Now, this plan can be formal or informal, high level or very detailed. It's going to depend on the project. It's going to be a very different situation if we're doing a very simple project, all things being considered. If you pay me to repave your driveway at your house, the acceptance basically becomes, has all the permitting been done correctly? Is it level? And have I cleaned up any mess that we might have made in the process? That might be it for the acceptance. But if we're dealing with something like software, where there's a whole lot more ambiguity, if one of my requirements is it has to be fast or it has to be easy to use, well, now it can get a little bit trickier. So we might want to have a much more formal structure here. We might want to have it very detailed to try and give some definition as to what does fast mean and how are we going to test that? What does easy to use mean and how are we going to test that? Another output from this process is the requirements management plan. So again, laying the groundwork for further planning processes. We're just trying to figure out how. How are these requirements going to be planned, tracked, and reported? How are we going to capture these, and how are we going to put them into some type of a register or some type of a document where we can ensure that they are being completed? So configuration management activities, and this is very important. We had spoke previously about the configuration management plan and how it relates to the change management plan. We want to look at how changes will be initiated and with the impacts that these changes will have, because all changes will have second and third order effects. It's going to have unintended consequences, and not just necessarily to the schedule or budget. It could also be to interoperability of other components of the deliverable. So maybe upgrading one piece of software will make another piece shut down, or maybe changing the operating system means that legacy software will no longer operate the way that we want it to. And we need to look at the authorization level to approve changes. Now, with these changes, we're kind of looking specifically at requirements within the project. So we're not looking at massively sweeping through everything else, like maybe making changes to a procurement activity. We're looking specifically at if we are adding or removing requirements, who's allowed to do that and under what circumstances. Now, the change request will still have to be evaluated as part of the perform integrated change control process, where we're going to look at those second and third order effects throughout the rest of the project. So a requirements prioritization process, and it's very important to capture this very early on within the project. If you start making decisions arbitrarily saying that this requirement is more important than this one, the human beings that gave you those requirements may feel slighted if you make a decision that is against their wishes. Now, if you have a process that is defined, you can go ahead, put your hands in the air, lean back, and point at some documentation and go, listen, we have a process. We came up with this 6 months ago, and we just used it for the first time. If you don't like the process, we can definitely discuss it, and we can definitely possibly look at changing it. But as it stands right now, this is how we are prioritizing conflicting requirements or trying to figure out what requirements will fit within the scope. And if you remove that human factor, you can remove a lot of conflict and you can make sure that those stakeholders remain appropriately engaged. Now, if you don't have a proper prioritization process and you are introducing a human factor, it's going to be much more difficult to go ahead and keep everybody satisfied. So, the product metrics, which ones are we picking and why are we picking them? So, perhaps we're looking at the mean time between failures or service interruptions, or maybe defects or defect frequencies. Different projects and different deliverables can benefit from the use of different metrics. And what type of attributes should we capture on the requirements traceability matrix, which we'll be seeing in some of the upcoming processes here? All we're doing is laying out the groundwork, building what the template should look like. So that way, when it is time to create that requirements traceability matrix, we know how to do it. So plan scope management is the process that we just discussed. A quick learning assessment. Describe the purpose of this process in your own words. The purpose is to chart a path for the development and maintenance of the project's scope. What are some things a scope management plan and requirements management plan might include? So, scope management plan will include things like how we will prepare the scope statement and the work breakdown structure, how we will go about getting formal approval for deliverables, how we'll go about requesting and obtaining changes to the scope baseline. The requirements management plan will contain things like how to prioritize and track requirements. What types of product metrics should we choose and why are we choosing them? And which attributes do we want to capture on the traceability matrix? What are some of the enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that play into this process? So for EEFs, it could include your organizational culture or structure, personnel administration, marketplace conditions. For OPAs, it could be a scope management plan or policy that you have within that corporate knowledge base, or maybe lessons learned from a past similar project. What type of experts should be involved in creating this plan? Anyone with expertise or knowledge in the development of scope management plans can provide expert insight. So think about your project management office if you have one. In what ways will we use these plans going forward? We'll use these plans to verify any action for scope or requirements changes, confirming how the scope will be accepted, and as a common basis for understanding how to manage project and product scope as well as assisting in managing stakeholder expectations. What primary type of risk will these plans help reduce? The risk of scope creep.